There's a story about how God was once approached by a scientist who said, "Listen, God, we've decided we don't need you anymore. These days we can clone people, we can transplant organs, and we can do all sorts of things that used to be considered miraculous." To this, God replied, "Don't need me, huh? How about we put your theory to a test? Why don't we have a competition to see who can make a human being, say, a male human being?" The scientist agrees. So God declares that they should do it like he did in the good old days when he created Adam. "Fine," says the scientist, and he bends down to scoop up a handful of dirt. "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa. Wait a minute," says God. Yeah, you're going to have to get your own dirt." Today we pick back up with our survey of the cumulative case arguments for the existence of God. Last time we looked at the Cosmological Argument, both the general form and the Kalam variant, and we began to consider the argument from design, also known as the Teleological Argument. Today we're going to pick back up with the Teleological Argument, looking at the intelligent design movement. We're going to ponder whether theism is in fact anti-science, as it is often said to be. Then we will ponder one of the deepest arguments, the Ontological Argument, followed by one of the most powerful arguments, the moral argument. Now today we're going to be talking about irreducible complexity, but let us keep in mind that complexity itself is worth pondering. The late American astrophysicist and cosmologist Carl Sagan once wrote, "The information content of the human brain expressed in bits is probably comparable to the total number of connections among neurons, about 100 trillion bits. If written out in English, say, that information would fill some 20 million volumes, as many as in the world's largest libraries. The equivalent of 20 million books is inside the heads of every one of us. The brain is a very big place in a very small space. The neurochemistry of the brain is astonishingly busy, the circuitry of a machine more wonderful than any devised by humans." In a work by Norman Geisler and Frank Turek entitled "I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist," Geisler and Turek expound upon Sagan's comment here. They write, "Actually, Sagan probably underestimated the brain's information content at 20 million books. Nevertheless, the figure is still stunning. Picture yourself at center court of Madison Square Garden several hours before a basketball game. You are the only one in the arena, and you are looking at almost 20,000 empty seats all around you. How many books would you have to stack on each seat in order to fit 20 million books in that arena? You would need to stack 1,000 books on each and every seat to fit 20 million books in Madison Square Garden. Think about that. The roof is not high enough to allow that many books. You'd have to blow off the roof and keep stacking. That's how much specified and complex information is between your ears. Sagan was indeed right that the brain is a very big place in a very small space, and it's something immeasurably more sophisticated than anything humans have ever created." Now, Sagan did not believe in God. He famously declared that the cosmos is all there is, all there ever has been, and all there ever will be. Yet he did believe in the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence, just not divine intelligence. But given his concession here, Geisler and Turek point out, if intelligent human beings can't create anything close to the human brain, why should we expect non-intelligent natural laws to do so? That was in Chapter 6 of their text. In Chapter 5, they dig at specific complexity. So when we talk about complexity, we can talk about a general complexity. We can look at the specifics more closely. And then if we dig deeply enough, we might find some cases of irreducible specificity or irreducible complexity. So in looking at more specific complexity within the human body in particular, they write, "The supreme problem for Darwinists is explaining the origin of the first life. For unguided naturalistic macroevolution to be true, the first life must have generated spontaneously from non-living chemicals. Unfortunately for Darwinists, the first life is by no means simple. DNA has a helical structure that looks like a twisted ladder, and it includes a 4-letter genetic alphabet. This alphabet is identical to our English alphabet in terms of its ability to communicate a message, except that the genetic alphabet has only 4 letters instead of 26. Just as the specific order of the letters in any given sentence communicates a unique message, the specific order of A, T, C, and G within a living cell determines the unique genetic makeup of that living entity. Another name for that message or information, whether it's in a sentence or in DNA, is specified complexity. In other words, not only is it complex, it also contains a specific message. The incredible specified complexity of life becomes obvious when one considers the message found in the DNA of a one-celled amoeba, a creature so small several hundred could be lined up in an inch. Staunch Darwinist Richard Dawkins, professor of zoology at Oxford University, admits that the message found in just the cell nucleus of a tiny amoeba is more than 30 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica combined. And the entire amoeba has as much information in its DNA as 1,000 complete sets of the Encyclopedia Britannica. In other words, if you were to spell out all of the A, T, C, and G in an amoeba, the letters would fill 1,000 complete sets of an encyclopedia. Now, we must emphasize, the authors write, that these 1,000 encyclopedias do not consist of random letters, but of letters in a very specific order, just like real encyclopedias. So here's the key question for Darwinists like Dawkins. If simple messages such as "take out the garbage, Mom," and "Mary loves Scott," and "drink Coke" require an intelligent being, then why doesn't a message 1,000 encyclopedias long also require one? Now that's an amoeba, but what about the human body? The data in the human body, so far as we understand it, is said to be comparable to 1.5 gigabytes. Now 1.5 gigabytes times 1 trillion cells is 150 trillion gigabytes, or 150 zettabytes. 1 zettabyte is worth 1,000 to the 7th power bytes, or 10 to the 21st power bytes, or 1,000,000,000,000,000,000,000,000,000,000,000 bytes. Now, this only refers to our momentary capacity for holding information. We're not talking about our capacity for archiving information. It said that one synapse can hold 4.7 bits of information. Now, this would mean that the human body has an overall capacity of 1 petabyte. A petabyte is approximately 10 to the 15th power bytes. There are 1,024 terabytes, or approximately 1 million gigabytes in a petabyte. So, for example, a typical DVD holds about 4.7 gigabytes of data. A petabyte of storage could hold 223,101 DVD quality movies. A petabyte's worth of data stored in 1 gigabyte flash drives would stretch over 92 football fields. So the human body has about a petabyte of archival capacity. That's roughly equivalent to 20 million 4-drawer filing cabinets filled with text, or 13.3 years of HD TV recordings, or 4.7 billion books, or 670 million web pages of information. The DNA of a single human cell is said to be equivalent to 25,200-page books. So the point here for one interested in arguments from design is that even the single-celled organism contains volumes of information. The human body is exceedingly complex with information. Yet information requires intelligence. I mean, think about it. The mind's storage capacity is 4.7 billion books. What kind of mind, by accident, requires that much information? Now, these examples of complexity are enough evidence for some to infer design. But one thing that has really driven interest in what's called the intelligent design movement is what is known as irreducible complexity. In these cases, you have multiple complex parts, all of which have to be there simultaneously in order for something to work. In the words of Michael Behe, a leading name in this area of study, an irreducibly complex system cannot be produced directly, that is, by continuously improving that initial function, which continues to work by the same mechanism. It cannot be produced directly by slight successive modifications of a precursor system, because any precursor to an irreducibly complex system that is missing a part is, by definition, non-functional.
I remember the first time I looked in a biochemistry textbook and I saw a drawing of something called the bacterial flagellum with all of its parts in all of its glory. It had a propeller and the hook region and the drive shaft and the motor and so on. I looked at that and I said, that's an outboard motor. That's designed, that's no chance assemblage of parts.
Behe's reaction was not surprising, for the molecular motors that drive bacteria through liquid each depend upon a system of intricately arranged mechanical parts. These parts come into focus when portions of a cell are magnified 50,000 times. Biochemists have used electron micrographs like this one to identify the parts and three-dimensional structure of the flagellar motor. In the process, they have revealed a marvel of engineering on a miniaturized scale.
Howard Berg at Harvard has labeled it the most efficient machine in the universe. These machines, some of them are running at 100,000 RPMs and are hardwired into a signal transduction or sensory mechanism so that it's getting feedback from the environment.
And even though they're spinning that fast, they can stop on a dime. It only takes a quarter turn for them to stop and shift directions and start spinning 100,000 RPM in the other direction.
And just like outboard motors on motorboats, it has a large number of parts which are necessary for the motor to work.
The bacterial flagellum, 2 gears, forward and reverse, water-cooled, proton motive force. It has a stator, it has a rotor, it has a U-joint, it has a drive shaft, it has a propeller, and they function as these parts of machines. It's not convenient that we give them these names. That's truly their function.
Since its discovery, scientists have tried to understand how a rotary motor could have arisen through natural selection. As yet, they have failed to offer any detailed Darwinian explanation. To see why, we must understand a feature of molecular machines known as irreducible complexity.
Irreducible complexity was coined by Mike Behe in describing these molecular machines. Basically what it says is that you have multi-component parts to any given organelle or system in a cell, all of which are necessary for function. That is, if you remove one part, you lose function of that system.
The idea of irreducible complexity can be illustrated by a familiar non-biological machine, a mousetrap. The trap is composed of 5 basic pieces: a catch to hold the bait, a strong spring, a thin bent rod called the hammer, a holding bar to secure the hammer in place, and a platform upon which the entire system is mounted. If any one of these parts is missing or defective, the mechanism will not work. All components of this irreducibly complex system must be present simultaneously for the machine to perform its function, catching mice. Irreducible complexity also applies to biological machines, including the bacterial flagellar motor.
All told, there are about 40 different protein parts which are necessary for this machine to work. And if any of those parts are missing, then either you get a flagellum that doesn't work because it's missing the hook or it's missing the drive shaft or whatever, or it doesn't even get built within the cell.
In evolutionary terms, you have to be able to explain how you can build this system gradually when there's no function until you have all those parts in place.
So the point is that some things appear to be irreducibly complex. That is, they're not the sort of thing that could evolve, since a certain level of complexity is required for it to function and continue to evolve. In the case of the flagellum, you have to have all the parts already there, the complexity already built in, so to speak, in order for it to function. Similarly, with DNA, we have a puzzling thing. DNA needs enzymes to replicate, but the enzymes are encoded by DNA.
In DNA, Kenyon encountered a molecule with a property he could not explain through natural processes. For locked securely within its double helix structure is a wealth of information in the form of precisely sequenced chemicals that scientists represent with the letters A, C, T, and G for adenine, cytosine, thymine, and guanine. In a written language, information is communicated by a precise arrangement of letters. In the same way, the instructions necessary to assemble amino acids into proteins are conveyed by the sequences of chemicals arranged along the spine of the DNA. This chemical code has been called the language of life, and it is the most densely packed and elaborately detailed assembly of information in the known universe.
Like other scientists working on the origin of life, Kenyon realized he had two choices. Either he had to explain where these genetic assembly instructions came from, or he had to explain how proteins could have arisen directly from amino acids without DNA in the primordial oceans. And in the end, he realized he could do neither.
It's an enormous problem how you could get together in one tiny submicroscopic volume of the primitive ocean all of the hundreds of different molecular components you would need in order for a self-replicating cycle to be established. And so my doubts about whether amino acids could order themselves into meaningful biological sequences on their own without pre-existing genetic material being present just reached, I guess for me, the intellectual breaking point sometime near the end of the decade of the 70s.
As Kenyon reevaluated his theory, new biochemical discoveries further weakened his conviction that amino acids could have organized themselves into proteins.
The more I conducted my own studies, including a period of time at NASA Ames Research Center, the more it became apparent that there were multiple difficulties with the chemical evolution account. And further experimental work showed that amino acids do not have the ability to order themselves into any biologically meaningful sequences.
Faced with mounting difficulties in his own theory and a growing body of scientific data about the importance of DNA, Kenyon was forced to confront the absolute necessity of genetic information.
The more I thought about the enormous problem that all of us who worked on this field had neglected to address, the problem of the origin of genetic information itself, then I really had to reassess my whole position regarding origins.
For Dean Kenyon, a new question became the focus of his search for life's origin. What was the source of the biological information in DNA?
If one could get at the origin of the messages, the encoded messages within the living machinery, then you would really be on to something far more intellectually satisfying than this chemical evolution theory.
Yet Kenyon faced a narrowing set of options, for he realized that, as with pure chance, natural selection was also limited in its creative power. By definition, natural selection could not have functioned before the existence of the first living cell, for it can only act upon organisms capable of replicating themselves, cells equipped with DNA that pass on their genetic changes to future generations.
Without DNA, there is no self-replication. But without self-replication, there is no natural selection. So you can't use natural selection to explain the origin of DNA without assuming the existence of the very thing you're trying to explain.
Darwin himself considered the possibility of this challenge. He wrote, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not have possibly been formed by numerous successive changes, my theory would absolutely break down." The eye is another example of a complex system. The idea is that for a biological system like this to develop over millions of years, it would not be functional until it were fully developed. And so it would seem, therefore, to be highly unlikely to have developed over millions of years. Now follow me here, because we can think of a damaged eye and think, well, it's still useful. Yet a damaged eye supposes that there is a way that an eye is supposed to work, and the damage means that it's not doing what it's supposed to do. That supposed to do is important. So the idea here is that it takes all of the wiring to be in place for the eye to function as the eye is supposed to function. And if the wiring is not in place, it's not functioning. And if it takes millions of years for that wiring to come into place, well, that doesn't sound like evolution, because evolution, by definition, is an unintelligent process. It can't intend future end goals, because intention is the product of a mind. So some would argue that the more likely conclusion, or using Occam's razor, the simpler explanation, is that there is a mind behind the complexity of the eye. Now, you could argue from here towards theistic evolution, that there is a mind. God uses an evolutionary process. In that case, you still have an evolutionary process, but you have the mind intending the process. Or you could advocate some other form of creationism. But the main claim of intelligent design is that when you look at the complexity of life, there is a clearly perceivable design, intention, purpose, information that strongly suggests a mind to have intended such things. A final point to note before we move on is that inferring intelligence does not require inferring perfection. And there's actually a problem with that, but I'll get to that in a moment. First of all, what do I mean? Well, some will look at complex systems and say, that's not an optimal design. That's a flawed design. The theory of intelligent design must be false. Look at the eye, for example. It's got a built-in blind spot. If it were created in a more perfect way, this could easily be avoided. Surely a creator would know this and would want to create something more perfect than flawed. Or take, for example, the neck of a giraffe. Now, intelligent design proponents will actually point to the artery function in a giraffe's neck as proof of intelligence. But Darwinian critics will ask us to look at the laryngeal nerve in the giraffe. Something that really only needs to be a few inches long actually takes what seems to be a 15-foot detour down the neck and back in order to do what it needs to do. And so the challenge is, what's intelligent about that? Is that not a stupid design? On the other hand, if this odd and seemingly unnecessary detour were present in the giraffe's ancestors prior to neck elongation, then it might make sense from an evolutionary perspective that as the neck elongated, so too did this odd traveling path of the laryngeal nerve. Or what is the purpose of what seem to be legs in a whale? And why give a panda bear a little nub instead of a well-working opposable thumb, with which they could surely function more proficiently? Now, while these are great questions for scientific inquiry, there is a philosophical, epistemological problem with such a challenge. First, and this is not the main point, note that to argue that something could have been designed better, you are seeming to concede that something bears design. Consider technology, for instance. It is easy to infer ways that we might improve upon something that has already been designed intelligently. But you can't do this if there is no intelligence there to infer. It's unintelligible. But that's not the philosophical problem I'm trying to press into here. The epistemic issue is that the only one qualified to speak as to whether something has been designed optimally or perfectly is a designer. And if the point here is to drag God, or the idea of God, into the dock in order to accuse and say, look at this horrible design, these are clearly design flaws. Well, we could not know that unless we knew the intent of the one that designed, right? If God created pandas to eat bamboo, well, opposable thumb or not, they seem to be able to do that quite well, don't they? Now, science is in the business of uncovering, and many times we think we have information, but we don't, and we come across new information, and sometimes we have to reevaluate past theories and rework some things, and we grow in light of that new understanding. And so it's possible that unusually long pathways involving laryngeal nerves may, at the end of all knowledge, actually serve a purpose. And it's possible that curious or curiously placed and seemingly non-functional bones in something like a whale may turn out to have a reason to which we just don't have access. So this may be one of those areas that happens in philosophy sometimes, whereof we just cannot speak. We don't have enough information. And so this is a good question for scientific inquiry. However, it is not a good philosophical refutation of the idea of intelligent design. Because aside from the fact that when you call something unintelligent design, you are still conceding design, the only way that you could know what is optimal design would be if you had all the facts. And science, by definition, is a method and a process. It will never have all the facts. Rather, it will always be a reflection upon what we have. Moreover, aside from curious questions such as these, what we have are numerous cases of striking complexity. What do we do with that? Scientists are divided on the answer. While Darwinian theory still holds the microphone, many scientists and philosophers are starting to challenge its authority. All right, so this brings us to the real core question here. People want to know, is science contrary to religion, in particular to the traditional monotheistic teachings that involve creation? Because if I love and want to be faithful to science, and I feel like I have to check my mind and research at the door in order to be faithful to the idea of God, well, that's going to give me pause, right? If I've built all of my life and research on the idea of evolution, will conceding the possibility of God's existence require that I throw all that out the window? Does it belittle my entire career and profession? From the other side in perspective, if I want to be faithful to God, am I somehow robbing Him of due respect? Am I taking away His power and sovereignty by saying that evolution is possible? There is a palpable and long-standing tension here. Yet many philosophers are arguing that it is unnecessary. In his work, Where the Conflict Really Lies, historically renowned philosopher Alvin Plantinga concluded there is superficial conflict, but deep concord between science and theistic belief, but superficial concord and deep conflict between science and naturalism. Naturalism, of course, being the view that there's only the material realm and nothing beyond. Now, Plantinga was a theist, and one of the big questions for many is whether Darwinian theory is compatible with religion. Interestingly, we get a strong criticism of Darwinian theory from an atheist philosopher, Thomas Nagel. The likelihood that self-reproducing organisms should have spontaneously come into existence, coupled with the likelihood that a genetic sequence of mutations should have occurred that was sufficient to make natural selection possible, leads us to the necessary conclusion of which he was so certain it is the subtitle of his book. that the materialist neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false. So it need not be an either-or, us-them divide. A growing number of scientists and philosophers agree that there is much room for concord, not conflict, between theism and science. Now, one of the main reasons for this infamous wedge is because so many people get unnecessarily caught up in battles to the death over the age of the earth, when in fact the truth of theism neither rises nor falls with the issue of time. Theism only requires that there was a point in time which came to be, a point of creation, and this actually lies in concord with the idea of a Big Bang. Now, part of the reason for this strong disagreement and the readiness to die on the hill of the Earth's age really comes down to ignorance. It's a straw man fallacy, for example, to equate creationism with the belief that the Earth was created in 6 literal days. There are actually many different positions on creationism. Some believe that the Earth was created in 6 literal days, which would make it a young Earth creationism. And this, of course, would seem to be the view that lies most in tension with the claims of modern science. But it is important to understand that not all theists hold this position, nor are all theists even certain where they stand on this non-essential issue. Others hold that the word, for example, in the Bible, day, is referring to a word meaning a period or a time. And in that case, you can still have an old earth creation, and you have periods of creation. And in fact, even from an evolutionary perspective, we think of different periods of time, don't we? So, as it relates to the age of the earth, some approach Scripture first and try to make science fit that. Others look at science and try to see how Scripture aligns with that. And still others view the two as largely unrelated. Science is unable to speak of theological things, and it was not the intent of Scripture to make scientific claims. Many non-theists are shocked to find out that there are theological evolutionists. That is, there are some people who believe in an evolutionary creationism. Accepting Darwinian theory, they also believe that the evidence in complexity points to a designing mind, and so they argue that God used an evolutionary process to bring about the intended order and creation. There are also other theories that don't fit neatly into these 3 packages. For example, if I hold a mature age view, I might even claim a position of agnosticism on this point. I may say, I don't really know, and it's not terribly significant to me because either way it doesn't affect the overall theistic narrative. But it seems to me that if God wanted to create in a single day, God could do so while giving the earth the appearance of a mature age. For example, if the biblical narrative is literally true that God, in one act on one day, if we take it a literal day, created Adam, a fully mature man. Well, in the day that Adam was created, how old was he? Well, he was 1 day or less old, right? And yet he would have had the appearance of a fully mature man, maybe someone around their 30s or 40s. Well, that certainly seems possible. And if God can do that with a human being, why couldn't he also create a world that has, on the day of its creation, the fullness of a mature appearance? In that case, what's really the point of our debate? Those who are arguing for a young earth literally may be correct, while those who are arguing for an older earth's appearance may also be correct. Now, there are some concerns or issues with this view. Don't get me wrong. It is an alternative view on the table, nevertheless. And then there's another view. Now, this is really fascinating. Some have argued that the biblical creation narrative was never actually intended to answer these sorts of questions. And so the debate misses the point. It was a narrative that was given to a particular people in a particular place at a particular time. In the biblical narrative, God's people, Moses is giving the narrative after having brought the Israelite people out of Egypt, out of 500 years of slavery, and they were entrenched in a foreign culture, and that culture's gods, and that culture's creation narrative. And in the biblical narrative, God would be taking them to a different land to give them that land, and that land is also filled with foreign people, with foreign ideologies, foreign creation narratives, foreign gods. And so in this context, you have Moses giving a creation narrative that is in some ways similar to those other narratives, but in other ways strikingly different. For example, rather than the gods, you have God. So from this perspective, the biblical creation narrative was never about the age of the earth, the when we begin. It has always been about the who began it, the sovereignty of God, God being the one who brought everything into existence. So this is an issue that unnecessarily divides us, and it is a hill that we need not choose to die upon. When it comes to theism, the age of the earth is not a salvific variable in any religion. In other words, what you believe about the age of the earth has no bearing on your salvation. I think some people fight this battle so passionately because they are afraid if they cannot give a definitive answer, then they lose. Then they have no credible reason to provide for believing their narrative. But that's not necessarily true. So science, generally speaking, is not antithetical to religion, nor religion to science. There may be some points of disagreement, but there are many points of agreement. And when and where there is disagreement, it usually involves very particular claims within particular schools of scientific thought, or very particular beliefs within particular schools of theistic thought. Of course, it's likely no surprise that the biggest point of tension for many involves the Darwinian conception of history. Again, though, as we just saw, some theists are evolutionary theists or theistic evolutionists in that they have no issue with a Darwinian idea of evolution, but they see God as necessarily behind it. Others do take issue with Darwinian evolution, but as we saw, this does not necessarily mean that they are a young Earth creationist. Some old Earth creationists still think that God is involved in a way other than that portrayed within the Darwinian model of macroevolution. So let's look a little closer at the reasons for this disagreement with Darwinian theory, which really comes down to macroevolution. Now this brings us to the idea of a challenge that is referred to as Darwin's black box. In other words, there may be many aspects of Darwinian theory that sound good or do well in explaining some things, but there are two glaring issues. The first involves first life. And to simplify things, I'm pulling again here from the Turek and Geisler text. The supreme problem for Darwinists is explaining the origin of the first life. Naturalistic macroevolution claims that first life generated spontaneously from non-living chemicals. The problem is that the DNA of a one-celled amoeba has as much ordered information as there is in 1,000 complete sets of the Encyclopedia Britannica. How likely is this to have happened spontaneously? We could not directly observe the origin of the first life. We can use forensic principles to discover the likely cause. The central principle in forensics is the principle of uniformity. That is, causes in the past are like causes we observe today. Today, when we see the equivalent of 1,000 encyclopedias of ordered information, we don't assume it happened spontaneously. There is always an intelligent cause for complex design. Nor have we ever witnessed or observed life coming from non-life. Many scientists have attempted to combine chemicals to get DNA molecules with no success. Darwinists insist that there is no intelligent design, that it only appears that way. Another issue is that DNA relies on proteins for its production, and proteins rely on DNA for their production. Neither could be first. So the creation-evolution debate is not about Bible versus science, it's about good science versus bad science. Bad science only considers one option and rules out others before looking at the evidence. This, the challenge is what Darwinists do. They allow their ideology to overrule observation and reason. That is bad science. The authors continue. Darwinists say if we give natural forces billions of years, they would create life. This is faulty reasoning. Nature brings things to disorder as time passes. This is the second law of thermodynamics. Chance is not a cause. Flip a coin. The chance it will come up heads is 50%. But what caused it to come up heads? The primary cause was an intelligent being who decided to flip a coin. Chance is not science. Our ability to reason came from one of two places. 1, pre-existing intelligence, or 2, mindless matter. Scientific observation demonstrates that an effect cannot be greater than its cause. You can't give what you don't have. Chemicals can't explain all of human thought. Concluding that life is the product of an intelligent designer makes sense because it is based on multiple pieces of evidence and reason. As physicist Hubert Yockey wrote, the belief that life on Earth arose spontaneously from non-living matter is simply a matter of faith in strict reductionism and is based entirely on ideology. So the first and perhaps the biggest problem for Darwinian theory is how we even get the first life from non-life. But the second problem, which is also a big deal, is how we arrive at new life forms. Now here it is essential that we clarify our language, and we are very particular with what we mean when we say what. This is where philosophy digs at wording. When you say evolve, what do you mean? I can evolve throughout time. I can evolve as a professional. I can evolve in my understanding and perspective, a sort of enlightenment. So in common parlance, evolve means change, and no one takes issue with that. It can mean change over time, or it could mean change across circumstances. What exactly you mean by change and how that change has occurred makes a difference. So we've got to clarify terms. Microevolution refers to adaptation. This is observed in science and undisputed. People who take issue with Darwinian evolution do not take issue with adaptation or small changes across time. Consider dog breeding, for example. This is an artificial selection rather than a natural selection. It's an intelligent process, and the breeding and change happens within species, and it happens within a relatively short amount of time. It does not happen across species, and it does not involve drawn-out change over a long period of time. Macroevolution involves the idea of major changes across species drawn out over long periods of time. And this is really where the debate hangs, because macroevolution is a theory, not a fact, and it has never been observed. And so it's hotly debated, and this is the point upon which Darwinian materialism hinges. The theistic critics will ask, does similarity of structure prove a common ancestor or a common designer? Does the similarity of design prove that a cooking pot, for example, evolved from the teaspoon? No satisfactory proof has ever been found. All we have is speculation about gaps and similarities. So here the critic is pressing into the point that we find, for example, in the fossil record, things that we can put in, for example, an ape-like class, and then other things that we might put into a human-like class. And so we can find in the fossil record things that belong within certain classes, but what we do not seem to find are things that are clear transitions between those classes. So the idea is that rather than actually discovering and being able to show definitively clear examples of macroevolution, what we seem to find are rather what some have called patterns of explosions, where new fossil forms have come into existence without definitively clear examples of an evolutionary precursor to that form. And so another big problem for Darwinian macroevolution is what is referred to as the Cambrian Explosion, or the Big Bang of life, the point at which almost all animal phyla suddenly started appearing in the fossil record. So, while no one takes issue with microevolution, many have pushed back against macroevolution, insisting that there is simply not sufficient evidence for it. The reasons for this skepticism include, first, genetic limits. We have observed no incidents of changes that cross species. Second, cyclical change. Changes within types appear to shift back and forth within a limited range, but never go outside species. So natural selection may explain the survival of a species, but never the arrival of a species. Third, irreducible complexity. In 1859, Darwin did not have the technology available to see that irreducible complexity is present in cells and living things. He stated that his theory would break down if that was true. Living things cannot survive slow trial and error changes to their organs because in transitional states the organs would not perform their necessary functions. Fourth, non-viability of transitional forms. Changes between species that Darwin suggests would put creatures in a form that would impair their survivability. For example, the transition from scales to feather, etc. Fifth, molecular isolation. Advocates of Darwinian theory think the similarity of DNA in all living creatures implies a common ancestry, but this could just as easily imply a common designer. At the molecular level, the basic types of animals are in molecular isolation from one another. There are no Darwinian transitions, only distinct molecular gaps. And of course, the fossil record itself causes problems. Darwin hoped that over time geologists would discover intermediate links between species. Instead, paleontologist and evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould wrote that the history of most fossil species reveals stasis and sudden appearance. First, most species exhibit no directional change, only limited and directionless change, stasis. Second, in any local area, species appear all at once and fully formed, with no signs of steady transformation. Because fossil evidence is open to many interpretations, and it cannot establish the ancestor-descendant relationships necessary for establishing Darwinian macroevolution. This is why many are skeptical when it comes to the idea of missing links in the fossil record.
Life started out with very simple forms, and then gradually, over hundreds of millions of years, morphed into all the forms we see today. Bacteria to Beethoven. Not a straight line, of course, but that's roughly how it went. This was the theory proposed by Charles Darwin in 1859, and with some modification, it's been embraced as unassailable by the scientific community over the last century. As evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins says, if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is either ignorant, stupid, or insane. But is that right? Are there no scientific reasons to doubt the evolutionary account of life's origins? In November 2016, I attended a conference in London convened by some of the world's leading evolutionary biologists. The purpose? To address growing doubts about the modern version of Darwin's theory. Let's look at just two scientific reasons to doubt this theory. First, the Cambrian Explosion. A weird and wonderful thing happened 530 million years ago. A whole bunch of major groups of animals, what scientists call the phyla, appeared abruptly within a geologically short window of time. About 10 million years. These novel animal forms exhibiting prototypes of most animal body designs we see today emerged in the fossil record without evidence of earlier ancestors. Did you catch that? A huge number of diverse animals appeared with no discernible antecedents. So where did they come from? This question really bothered Darwin, and he acknowledged that he could give it no satisfactory answer. Nor can scientists today. The renowned biologist Eugene Koonin of the National Center for Biotechnology Information describes the abrupt appearance of the Cambrian animals and other organisms such as dinosaurs, birds, flowering plants, and mammals as a pattern of biological big bangs. So what caused all these new forms of life to arise? That question leads to a second big doubt, the DNA enigma. In the 1950s, James Watson and Francis Crick made a startling discovery. The DNA molecule stores information as a 4-character digital code. Strings of precisely sequenced chemicals inside the DNA helix store the instructions, the information, for building the crucial proteins that cells need to survive. Unless the chemical letters in the DNA text are sequenced properly, a protein molecule will not form. No proteins, no cells. No cells, no living organisms. Bill Gates has said DNA is like a software program. Let's think about that for a second. For computers to run faster and perform more functions, they require new code. Well, the same is true for life. To build new forms of life, the evolutionary process would need to produce new genetic information, new code. But this raises questions about the creative power of natural selection and mutation. Natural selection is a simple sorting process. Species keep favorable mutations that allow them to survive, but eliminate bad mutations that cause their members to die out. No one doubts that natural selection is a real process, and that it produces minor variations. But many biologists now doubt that it produces major innovations in biological form. To see why, think again about software. What happens if you introduce a few random changes into computer code? You'll likely mess it up, right? Though it might still work if you don't make too many changes. But if you make enough random changes, your program will stop functioning altogether. You certainly can't keep doing this and expect some cool new program to pop out. There's a mathematical reason for this. In all codes and languages, there are vastly more ways of arranging characters that will generate gibberish than there are arrangements that will generate meaningful sequences. And this applies to DNA. Remember, natural selection only selects sequences that random mutations generate. Yet experiments have established that DNA sequences capable of making stable proteins are extremely rare, and thus really hard to stumble on randomly. How rare? While working at Cambridge University, molecular biologist Douglas Ack showed that for every DNA sequence that generates a relatively short functional protein, there are 10 to the 77th power non-functional sequences. Now consider that there are only 10 to the 65th power atoms in our galaxy. So finding a new DNA sequence capable of building a functional protein is like searching blindfolded for a single marked atom among 1 trillion Milky Way galaxies. Talk about a needle in a haystack. As I show in my book Darwin's Doubt, even 4 billion years of life's history is not enough time to overcome a search problem this big. So 2 serious doubts about modern Darwinian theory. The Cambrian Explosion, the sudden appearance of new animals which evolutionary theory has failed to explain, and the DNA enigma, the implausibility of random mutations producing the information needed to build new forms of animal life. Scientists who know about these problems are not ignorant, stupid, or insane. They are just appropriately skeptical.
In the words of philosopher and theologian Greg Koukl, if the Darwinian model predicts certain things, in the fossil record for example, and it turns out that there are systematic gaps that are inconsistent with the prediction, the standard scientific approach then is to doubt the model, and that's what we're doing. The Cambrian Explosion is a huge embarrassment to evolutionists precisely because it is exactly the opposite of what you would expect would be the case if the Darwinian model were true. So not only is the evidence missing for the Darwinian materialist theory of macro-evolving species, there is also direct evidence against it, the fossil record, that seems to suggest the intrusion of an intelligent designer. A theistic explanation is on the table. Evolutionists have no explanation. Now, to be clear, an evolutionary creationist or theistic evolutionist might believe that evolution occurred, but that God was actively involved at each stage. On the other hand, an evolutionary creationist or theistic evolutionist might accept the standard Darwinian model, including its natural mechanism for change. God wound it up and let it go, so to speak. But on this point, even if theistic evolution might be true in some other senses, the fossil record raises the same problems concerning this naturalistic mechanism for theistic evolution as it does with Darwinian materialism. So the problem really comes down to life from non-life and the materialist mechanism for macroevolution. Is this a science of the gaps argument? I'll leave it to you to ponder and decide for yourself. Let's move on to a few additional arguments for the existence of God. First, let's take a brief look at 5 arguments made popular by Thomas Aquinas, some of which are actually a review of arguments we discussed in our last lecture. First, influenced greatly by Aristotle here, Aquinas argues from motion. Our senses prove that some things are in motion. Things move when potential motion becomes actual motion. Only an actual motion can convert a potential motion into an actual motion. Nothing can be at once in both actuality and potentiality in the same respect. Therefore, nothing can move itself. Therefore, each thing in motion is moved by something else. The sequence of motion cannot extend ad infinitum into eternity past. Therefore, it is necessary to arrive at a first mover, put in motion by no other, an unmoved mover. And this everyone understands to be God. Next, he offered a cosmological argument, an argument from an efficient cause. We perceive a series of efficient causes of things in the world. Nothing exists prior to itself. Therefore, nothing in the world of things we perceive is the efficient cause of itself. If a previous efficient cause does not exist, neither does the thing that results, the effect. Therefore, if the first thing in a series does not exist, nothing in the series exists. If the series of efficient causes extends ad infinitum into the past, then there would be no things existing now. That is plainly false. There are existing things now that came through efficient causes. Therefore, efficient causes do not extend ad infinitum into the past. Therefore, it is necessary to admit a first efficient cause, to which everyone gives the name God. He also argues from possibility and necessity. We find in nature things that are possible to be and not to be, that come into being and go out of being. These are contingent things, contingent beings. Assume that every being is a contingent being. For each contingent being, there is a time it does not exist. Therefore, it is impossible for these always to exist. Therefore, there could have been a time when no things existed. Therefore, at that time, there would have been nothing to bring the currently existing contingent beings into existence. Therefore, nothing would be in existence now. We have reached an absurd result from assuming that every being is a contingent being. Therefore, not every being is a contingent being. Therefore, some being exists of its own necessity, and does not receive its existence from another being, but rather causes them. This all men speak of as God. He also argues from a gradation of being. There is a gradation to be found in things. Some are better or worse than others. Predications of degree require reference to the uttermost case. For example, a thing is said to be hotter according as it more nearly resembles that which is hottest. Now, the maximum in any genus is the cause of all in that genus. Therefore, there must also be something which is to all beings the cause of their being, goodness, and every other perfection, and this we call God. And finally, he offers a teleological argument with which we should be well familiar by now. We see that natural bodies, things in nature, work toward some goal, and do not do so by chance. Most natural things lack knowledge, but an arrow reaches its target because it is directed by an archer. What lacks intelligence achieves goals by being directed by some source of intelligence. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. Now let's look at one of the most profound, and for many, one of the most difficult arguments. So here we meet St. Anselm of Canterbury, who lived from 1033 to 1109, and his concept of the being than which nothing greater can be conceived. First, we have to understand his terms. He sees foolishness as understanding that God exists, and then not believing that God exists. The ontological argument is meant to prove that all of us have an understanding of God's existence, and by God we mean a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. Now, the mind is a place where many conceivable things may exist, but reality is a place where the greatest beings exist, for to exist beyond the mind is greater than to be confined within the mind, unable to exist beyond it. Now, there is a difference between something having existence within the understanding and understanding that something exists. To exist beyond the world need not mean that such existence is necessary, except in one case, and this is the case with which Anselm is concerned. While one might make the case that actual unicorns would have greater being than imaginary ones, indeed this would be so, it does not follow that unicorns must therefore exist in the real world, for they are not a being than which nothing greater is conceivable. A Pegasus unicorn hybrid would seem to be even greater, perhaps even a luck dragon. Their hypothetical existence is still only contingent. It is not necessary. Nevertheless, unicorns, in fact, exist in the mind. Anselm's point is this: supposing that he or she is applying the definition of God appropriately as the being than which nothing greater is conceived. Even the fool understands that God has existence within the mind, for one cannot attack an idea that one can neither have nor share. The second move in Anselm's 1-2 punch is this: even the fool, if he or she is applying the definition of God appropriately, is compelled to concede that actual is greater than potential existence. So his argument is basically a reductio ad absurdum. Suppose P. From P it follows that Q. But Q is absurd. Therefore P must be false. Here's his argument. Suppose with the fool, he says, that God exists in the understanding alone. Given our definition, this means that a being than which nothing greater can be conceived exists in the understanding alone. But this being can be conceived to exist in reality. That is, we can conceive of a circumstance in which theism is true, even if we do not believe that it actually obtains. But it is greater for a thing to exist in reality than for it to exist in the understanding alone. Hence, we seem forced to conclude that a being than which nothing greater can be conceived to be greater than it is. But that is absurd. Therefore, premise 1, the notion that God exists in the understanding alone, must be false. God must exist in reality as well as in the understanding. So if something is possible, it exists in a possible reality. If something is necessary in reality, then it is necessary in all realities. The ontological argument claims that if it is possible for God to exist, given the definition, then God must exist. If God were real, what sort of thing would he be? By definition, nothing could be greater than God, or else that would be God. So what sort of attributes would the greatest conceivable being possess? Being all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving. Being immaterial, that is greater than matter, which is destructible. So indestructible. being necessary. For to exist in all possible realities is greater than being bound only to some. So we could spin the argument this way. The idea of God is possible, so it is possible for God to exist. So God exists in a possible world. In the reality where God exists, he is necessary by definition. So, by definition, as the being than which nothing greater is conceivable, he would have to be necessary in all possible worlds. This, of course, would include our world, our reality. If God, by definition, is necessary in our reality, then he must exist in our reality. So God does exist in our reality. All right, but wait a minute. Can't this argument be used to prove all kind of weird things? What about Pinky, the necessary unicorn? Well, I suppose that won't work since unicorns we think of material things. And I suppose we've got to be able to account for those other attributes like omnipotence and omniscience and stuff. So what about Pinky, the immaterial, all-powerful, all-knowing, necessary unicorn? Well, this is going to be a category error, much like the flying spaghetti monster, because when we think of unicorns or things made of spaghetti, we are talking about material things, whether or not they exist only in the mind. And an immaterial thing cannot also be a material thing, or you have a contradiction. And there is nothing necessary about a material thing. Material things do not have to be. Okay, well, fair enough. So let's consider an immaterial being. Let's call it Gaga. No relation to Lady Gaga, this Gaga is an immaterial, necessary spirit who also happens to be all-powerful and all-knowing, but not all good, or at least not always good. Now, there's nothing about Gaga himself that is nonsensical. Is it possible for other spirits to exist? Sure, why not? Well, does this cause a problem? Does this show that the ontological argument can be used to show that Gaga exists just as easily as the traditional monotheistic God? Can't we use the argument to prove all sorts of little gods and spirits exist in our reality then? Wouldn't that be ridiculous? Well, let's look more closely at what's going on here. If something is all-powerful, then it can create or destroy anything if it wants, right? Now, if God and Gaga both exist, and God has the power to make Gaga not exist, then there's a possible reality where Gaga doesn't exist. But this would mean that Gaga is not a necessary being after all. So either you can believe that God is possible, which means there's no such thing as a necessary Gaga, or you believe that Gaga as necessary is possible, which means that God cannot be necessary. So you can't argue for just anything, only necessary beings, and not just any sort of necessary being. Should we believe in God or Gaga? It cannot be both. And there are good reasons for thinking that God is possible rather than Gaga. First of all, we get the whole idea of Gaga from the definition of God, simply by taking away some of the things that we attribute to God in order to make Gaga great, like we understood God to be. Again, note Anselm's point that we already have a working definition of what we mean by God. So if you believe that Gaga is possible, you should also believe that God is possible. You're working with the same parts of definitions. But if God is possible, of course there cannot be a Gaga. Moreover, Occam's razor tells us to go with a simpler explanation, and if we're digging at the definition of a maximally great being, then we would need good reason to pull back some of those maximal attributions. Why not give the full definition? To say it another way, it is simpler to believe that a perfectly great God is possible rather than a nearly perfect great God, because then we have some points of confusion in our language. And according to this argument, if it is even possible that a being than which nothing greater is conceived exists, then you have already conceded that he does. Finally, let's look at arguments from human experience. Now, these are some of my favorite to explore and discuss, but unfortunately we don't have a lot of time to do that. These arguments target our deep convictions concerning justice, beauty, desire, and meaning, or else they dig at the profundity of human consciousness. The moral argument can be put in a few different ways depending on whether you want to argue in a positive or a negative direction. In terms of a moral law, you could say, if there is a moral law, there must be a moral lawgiver. There is an objective moral law. Our convictions testify to this. Therefore, there must be a moral lawgiver. Now that's a modus ponens argument that begins with moral law. Here's a modus tollens that begins with God. If there is no God, then there is nothing to ground any objective sense of justice or injustice. It is not the case that there is no real sense of justice and injustice. Our experience and intuitions testify to the contrary. Therefore, it is not the case that there is no God. To put this in a different form of modus ponens, if there exists an objective sense of goodness, evil, right and wrong, justice, then there must exist a being that grounds goodness, rightness, wrongness, justice. There does exist an objective sense of goodness, evil, right, wrong, and justice. Therefore, there does exist a being able to ground such ideals. Now, justice is a big deal. Justice is key. People are quick to say that there are no objective universals or moral absolutes or things like this. But they're also really quick to cry out injustice and to demand justice in their societies and in a global sense. But what does that mean? Moral philosopher Louis Boyman astutely observed that throughout time, across culture, and throughout history, we do indeed carry a universal sense of justice. We may differ in our practices, that's applied ethics, but we are quite unified in our convictions that justice is real. And the way that justice has traditionally been defined or assumed throughout history is give to each one his or her due. Now, we may differ on what is due and to whom it is due, but we're all convinced. We share a universal conviction that something or some things are in fact due to someone or some people. And that is what we argue about when we claim that justice ought to be served, or we cry injustice. We are saying that what is due to someone is not being properly given. But that sense of dueness, that sense of properness, that appeal to a way it ought to be, that's a robust concept of justice that's only grounded in the idea that there is a way it ought to be. And that's a throwback to a theistic worldview. So when it comes to moral issues, we may say one thing, that there is no absolute truth, but our reactions in the face of injustice often bespeak our convictions. We are all certain of injustices, yet we cannot know injustice unless we know justice. When he was still an atheist, C.S. Lewis once wrote, "There cannot be a God because there is too much injustice in the world." Yet real moral disagreements imply an objective standard, for how would you know who's right or who's wrong unless there is a right or wrong? C.S. Lewis later, after converting to first to theism and then to Christianity, later asked, "How could I know that a line is crooked unless I already had an idea of a straight line?" Another argument from experience of which Lewis was fond, and one of my favorite as a philosopher of aesthetics and music, is the idea of desire or arguments from beauty. As with morality, people who study beauty are quick to point out that there are no universals in practice. Yet, as we saw with justice, there is a nagging question about why, if there is no universality to the beauty expressed through art, why do people everywhere, throughout time, throughout culture, use the arts to attempt to imitate or express beauty if there is no universal recognition of beauty? Now, we don't have time here to go into philosophy of art, but just to draw out the argument, as a romantic, Lewis was convinced that the arts give us insight into deep convictions, deep intuitions concerning a beauty that we aren't necessarily able to express in other forms of logical reasoning. And yet beauty, whether in nature or the arts, has a way of digging at our deep desires and drawing something out of us, a deep sense of longing, which he called Sehnsucht, a German term. Aware of a deep sense of longing concerning the beauty of nature that he realized early as a child, and a desire for beauty that followed him throughout his young adulthood and life as an atheist, that kept drawing him back to romantic literature. After converting to theism, Lewis said, "If I find it in myself a desire, a deep desire, that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most likely explanation is that I was made for another world." This is the argument from desire. Finally, we have an argument from mind. Now, here I'm actually going back to Thomas Nagel, an atheist, in his work Mind and Cosmos that I referenced earlier when he was taking issue with macroevolution. Nagel says, Darwinian naturalism is unable to explain the development of cognition and just how we should be able to perceive anything about ourselves from beyond ourselves. He adds, there is an inability of strict materialism to account for mind and consciousness. How do you know what you are thinking? What makes you think you can trust your thoughts on science? Why not think thoughts are determined according to natural processes, just like everything else on the Darwinian model? So the argument from consciousness is really a throwback to the problem of determinism and the mind-body problem. If mind and individual identity is to mean anything significant, and our experience testifies that it does, then the grounding for such meaningfulness must point beyond chance processes and the mechanistic nature of matter and motion. This concludes our primer on theistic apologetics, our brief survey of some of the cumulative case arguments and evidences in defense of the existence of God. Next week, we turn to the problem of evil.